Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. In our lectionary cycle for this year, we begin the Sermon on the Mount. Actually, technically it began last week, except we had a feast day that moved, kind of bumped it. So last week, normally, unless David changed it, you would have had the Beatitudes. Did you guys read the Beatitudes last week? No, I didn't think so. There was a feast day that got in the way. So anyway, last week normally would have been the Beatitudes, and then we have this section of the Sermon on the Mount, and then the rest of chapter 5, 6, and 7 and 8 even, or however far it goes, a long way. So what's really important, I think, is to keep all this in context. And so we begin with the Beatitudes. Jesus goes up the mountain and sits down and starts in teaching and starts with the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are those who hunger or thirst for righteousness. You all know these Beatitudes. And this really what Jesus is saying is this is who you are. As followers of Jesus, you are blessed if you are poor in spirit. If you are one that you feel spiritually empty or dry, you will find the kingdom of heaven. This is who you are. If you feel spiritually poor, you will find the kingdom of heaven. These are sort of the guarantees that go along with being a follower of Jesus. If you're one who mourns, you will be comforted. You will be blessed with comfort. If you hunger and thirst for righteousness, you will be blessed with fulfillment. If you are merciful, you will be blessed with mercy. And it goes on in the Beatitudes. And then we have Jesus saying, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And once again, he is telling you as a follower of Christ, this is who you are. This is the reality. By virtue of the fact that you follow Jesus Christ, you are salt and you are light. It's not like you ought to be salt and light or try to be salt and light. You are salt and light. Not that you're becoming salt and light. You are salt. You are light in the world. And I think this is something that we can take to heart. What does it mean to us as followers of Christ that we are salt and light? And if you just think about it, what is light like? Well, it illuminates things. It reveals things. It enlightens us. It helps people to see. We become enlightened by Christ, and as the light of the world, we take that light into the world. We become enlightened, and as we take the light into the world, others become enlightened. And the world comes to fullness through each one of us together as followers of Christ, light in the world. And what is salt like? Well, we all know what salt does for a juicy steak or a ripe tomato. It brings out the flavor. We also know that salt can cleanse and it can heal. So as salt on the earth, we bring those things into the earth. We bring out the best of each other. We enhance each other. And we help each other to be cleansed and to be healed. And the thing about salt and light is that it brings out the differences that we have. It brings out all kinds of things, but that's one thing it brings out. When we are salty, our different flavors come through. And when our light within illuminates another person, we can see clearly the uniqueness of each person. Also what we have in common, how we can relate, how we can delight in each other. So that light gives us gifts upon gifts. So without each other, we are less. We are not enhanced. We are not seen. We're not enlightened. We are not the fullness of who God calls us to be. You are salt and you are light. You have the effect of illuminating, of enhancing the uniqueness of another, of affecting cleansing and bringing healing. As long as we don't lose that light, we let the light of Christ work through us. And as long as we don't lose our saltiness, we let that saltiness of Christ work through us. Now, here's where that salesman would say, but wait, there's more. Because there's a lot more here to just being salt and light. Jesus has this incredible vision that he is sharing with us. Jesus is describing a new reality because we're not just salt and light, we are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. We are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. Now we can lose our light or our saltiness, we can hide our light, and Jesus says what a waste that is. The world, the earth, are less than they could be. So without us followers of Jesus, the world will have less light and flavor. The world misses out. And what Jesus is saying to you is as light and salt as you are, as I am, we change the world. That is what Jesus intends for us followers. Now, in this section of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus goes on to say that he did not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill the law and the prophets. And Jesus is saying, you are salt and light, you are blessed, and I am the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And then he tells us a little bit about how we can value the law and the prophets. Do not disregard or remove any aspect of the law and prophets. Keep the commandments. And then he says to us, your righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees. Now, I can imagine people in the crowd that day going, we are all is lost. How can we possibly exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees? Because that in that day, those were the spiritual leaders of the day. The religious law keepers, really. They were the examples for everyone. So it seems to us that Jesus has set a very high bar. But here's a few things to keep in mind. First of all, the Pharisees are a brood of vipers, and they don't really seem to keep that law. Perhaps they're keeping the letter of the law, which is what they did. They did that kind of compulsive, obsessively. They would keep the letter of the law. But what Jesus is talking about is the spirit of the law. the real meaning of the law, the spirit of the law. And then he goes on in this Sermon on the Mount to tell us, well, this is the spirit of the law. You have heard it said, but I say to you. The whole rest of chapter 5 is those sayings. You have heard it said, but I say to you. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, turn the other cheek. You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And there's a whole list of you have heard it said, but I say to you. This is what the law really means, and this is how our righteousness can exceed that of the Pharisees. Not keeping the letter of the law, but living by the spirit of the law. It doesn't say just about don't murder. It's about more than that. And Jesus tells us, don't murder in your heart. And he goes on with those spirit of the law interpretations. So one way we can look at the spirit or the Sermon on the Mount is the beginning part, the blessed are you, and you are the salt and the light. Those tell us who we are. And then the second, or the rest of the Sermon on the Mount says how to do that. It's who you are and then how to do it. 2 sections, beginning with who you are and then what that looks like, how you are to behave. And as I said, Jesus is doing something new in our world. And as salt and light and the blessed ones, we participate in that. You see, Jesus is teaching something pretty radical and kind of turning the world upside down. Because didn't we always think that our religious leaders were honorable teachers and good spiritual leaders and people you could trust to demonstrate what the law says and to live by it? Didn't we always think that? Jesus says no. But no, these are not the blessed ones. They are not the ones who earn any rewards. You are the blessed ones. You will be rewarded with mercy and comfort, being called the children of God. Your thirst and hunger for righteousness will be satisfied. Not those Pharisees that we always thought earned rewards. They are not the light of the world, the salt of the earth. You are. It's as if Jesus is saying to us today, even maybe, don't go to those religious leaders, the churches, to find the light and the salt. No, those folks are hypocrites and fakes. Don't look for people with authority, with fancy robes, with big titles. If you are looking for salt and light, go into the streets and look for the peacemakers. Go into the streets and look for those who hunger and thirst. Go into the streets and find those who mourn. Find the pure in heart. Find the persecuted. That's where you will find salt and light. And those are the people that you can be out in the street, in the world, peacemakers, people who hunger and thirst for righteousness, people who mourn, who are poor in spirit, the meek, the merciful, the pure in heart, the persecuted. You are salt and light. You are blessed. And as people who are blessed and salt and light, we with Jesus bring in the new kingdom. The new kingdom of God, which will not look like what we expect. We must go into the world and find the kingdom. We must go into the world and make the kingdom, because you are salt and light. And we don't want to lose our saltiness. We don't want our light under a bushel basket. You can lose yourself. You can hide yourself. but you can't change the fact that you are salt and light. And since you are salt and light, you are blessed. We are called to behave like salt and light. And Jesus tells us what that's like. It's very familiar. You have heard it said, you shall not murder. I say to you, if you are angry with another, you are liable to judgment. And Jesus goes on, you have heard it said that you shall not commit adultery. I say, if you look at another, you have already committed adultery. You have heard it said, you shall not bear false witness. I say to you, do not swear at all. You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemies. And I say to you, love your enemies and pray for them. Jesus goes on in the Sermon of the Mount. He gives us directions about almsgiving and prayer and fasting and wealth and spiritual health. He tells us don't worry about earthly things. He tells us don't judge others. He calls us to ask and seek and knock. And finally, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And if this is how you behave, then he wraps it up with, bear fruit. Don't just be a hearer of this word, but be a doer of this word. And that's what it means for each of us to be salt and light. You are ones who are blessed. As followers of Jesus, you are salt and you are light. And Jesus gives us a whole sermon on how to do that in the world. It sounds like a lot to do, so let's get to work. Amen.